Mel Gibson didn't just make a movie, he built a personal monument, a work that wasn't born out of a desire to entertain, but rather out of an almost spiritual impulse. The Passion of the Christ didn't emerge from a studio brainstorm, a market research project, or a gamble to please an audience in search of novelty. It was born of a man in conflict with the world around him, and at peace only with his conviction. Gibson didn't want to tell the story of Jesus the way so many others had done before. He wanted to touch the essence, to go beyond the clean theatrical surface that traditional cinema usually delivered. He wanted to show the blood, the flesh, the pain, but not for the sake of the pain itself. He wanted the suffering to have weight, for the cross to be not just a symbol, but an event. He wanted the viewer to be forced to face what is normally avoided, sacrifice in its rawest, most human, most brutal form. To do this, he had to go against everything and everyone. Hollywood didn't want this film. Major studios rejected it. Producers said it was a crazy, unacceptable project. A film in Aramaic, with no American stars, with torture scenes that would make the censors cringe. Who would finance it? Who would distribute it? Who would buy tickets? But Gibson didn't back down. If it meant selling his own assets, he would. And in fact, that's what he did. He financed the whole thing with his own money. He took a risk that could have been his undoing, but the risk was proportionate to the purpose. And what was that purpose? To show the truth according to his faith, the truth that touched him in an intimate, almost mystical way. He believed that the story of Christ had been too soft-pedaled, that the brutality of the sacrifice had been erased for convenience, that modern culture had turned Jesus into a symbolic, fragile, almost folkloric character. For Gibson, Christ was not an empty symbol. He was real, and if he was real, then he suffered, and if he suffered, the world needed to see it. It needed to remember it. Here's the thing to understand. The Passion of the Christ isn't just about Jesus. It's about what it means to stay true to your vision in a world that constantly pressures you to give it up. Gibson knew that the film industry is shaped by vested interests, by agendas, by carefully crafted images. He'd been a part of it himself. He'd starred in blockbusters, directed epics, won awards. He had it all: money, fame, influence. But he decided to risk it all for a message that moved him from the inside out. And this is where the story begins to expand beyond the cinema. Because this is not just a case of independent production. It is an act of faith, a gesture that borders on artistic martyrdom. When filming The Passion, Gibson placed himself in a position similar to that of the character he portrayed, vulnerable, attacked, alone. The media called him a fanatic. Academics accused the film of being excessively violent. Some critics labeled it religious sensationalism. Organized groups tried to boycott it, and he remained silent, or when he spoke, he did so calmly, firmly, like someone carrying a cross, without dramatization, without victimization. The curious thing is that despite all this resistance, the film became a phenomenon. Driven almost exclusively by word of mouth, it broke down linguistic, cultural, and even religious barriers. People who had never been interested in biblical cinema were touched. Churches filled up screenings. Families cried together. Not because it was a good film, but because it was something rare, authentic. And authenticity, even when controversial, is magnetic. This authenticity, however, came at a price. Gibson began to be viewed with suspicion by many sectors of the industry. He was no longer the charismatic star. He was the man from the Passion movie, the one who talks about God in interviews, the one who challenges political correctness, the one who takes unpopular positions. But for him, all of this was secondary. What mattered was the legacy, the memory, the message. There is a specific scene in the film, the moment when Jesus falls, bloodied, and his mother runs to him, that sums up the spirit of the work. Time seems to stand still. Suffering, pain, and despair intertwine with love. It is not just another film, it is a visual outcry, a cinematic prayer. And this is not manufactured with script or directorial tricks. It comes from the soul. It comes from the courage to artistically bare oneself before the world. And that is why the Passion of the Christ is disturbing, because it is not neutral. It does not try to please. It does not hide behind subtle metaphors or soft aesthetics. It bleeds, it hurts, and in doing so, it reveals more about the viewer than about Christ himself. Those who watch that suffering and are moved may be rediscovering something they had forgotten, that the sacred is often uncomfortable, and that true faith does not seek comfort, it seeks truth. Gibson, in this sense, did not just make films. He made an act of resistance against superficiality, against spiritual anesthesia, against artistic conformism. He reminds us that there are stories that need to be told, even if they cost a lot. That there are truths that cannot be silenced for cultural convenience. That art, when connected to an inner mission, is capable of moving mountains, even if it does not please everyone. And maybe that's exactly the point. It's not about pleasing, it's about touching, about provoking, about making you think. And even if some reject or criticize, the impact is made. The seed is planted, and Gibson's courage continues to echo as a reminder. It is possible to be true to yourself amid the noise of the world. It is possible to carry your cross and still turn the journey into art. Mel Gibson, when he decided to take on this project, knew there would be no turning back. It was like crossing a desert with no guarantee of finding water on the other side. And he wasn't just gambling his career, he was gambling his identity. Because The Passion of the Christ is not a film of compromise. It doesn't try to soften itself to make it palatable. It doesn't try to dilute it to fit into industry boxes. On the contrary, it is a cry that pierces the veil of artistic neutrality and that exacts an immense emotional and personal toll. During filming, the atmosphere on set was almost spiritual. Many reported moments of absolute silence between scenes, as if the entire crew were aware that something sacred was being enacted before their eyes. Actor Jim Caviezel, chosen to play Jesus, went through extreme physical and psychological experiences. Intense cold, falls, real injuries, isolation, all to maintain the integrity of what was being conveyed. But the most powerful thing wasn't the stage suffering, it was the truth felt behind the scenes. Many crew members reported that the film wasn't just a job, it was a calling. People who had no connection to the Christian faith felt something different there, something alive, something that went beyond the cinema and touched the invisible, and this was only possible because Gibson had the courage not to dilute, not to over-explain, to let the silence speak for itself. And silence is a powerful thing, especially when used consciously. In The Passion of the Christ, the moments when nothing is said are precisely the most devastating. Mary's gaze, standing before her son's pain, says more than 1,000 dialogues. The expression of the Roman soldier faced with Jesus' meekness reveals an internal conflict that no script could write, and Christ himself, when beaten, remains silent, a silence that screams, that accuses, that reveals the cruelty of the world and at the same time the resistance of those who love until the end. This contrast between violence and love, brutality and surrender, forms the heart of the film, and that was precisely what many critics did not know or did not want to understand. They said the film was too violent, but they did not realize that the violence is not there to shock, it is there to confront, to unmask, to show that love, when it is true, is not expressed only in sweet words, but in radical gestures, and that this love, embodied in Christ, cannot be understood in the light of a commercial or aesthetic logic. Gibson knew this, and that's why he chose risk over omission. He chose intensity over neutrality. He chose to make a film that would disturb people, but that had soul, rather than just another product that would be digested and forgotten. And that's when he broke with the system, because Hollywood, with all its lights and awards, values spectacle more than sacrifice. It values form more than content. And when someone decides to reverse this logic, the system reacts. It rejects it, it ridicules it. And that's exactly what happened to him. After the film's box office success, people expected Gibson to be celebrated, but what they saw was the opposite. He was isolated, attacked, persecuted. His personal mistakes, real like those of any human being, were cruelly exposed. The media, which had previously applauded him, turned their backs. Not because he had done something unforgivable, but because he had broken the pact of silence. He had said too much, he had shown too much, he had challenged too much, and it is at this point that the story takes on even deeper tones. Because what is at stake is not just the trajectory of a filmmaker, it is the clash between two worlds, the world of entertainment as distraction and the world of art as truth. Gibson chose the latter, and in doing so, he exposed himself in a radical way. He knew that he would not be understood by everyone. But he also knew that somewhere in the world, someone would be touched. And that was enough. The truth is that The Passion of the Christ is not a film that is watched with the eyes. It is a film that is experienced with the soul. There is something in its structure, in its poetic brutality, in its silences and pauses, that forces us to confront our own condition. That forces us to ask, what would I do if I were there? Would I also spit? Would I also turn my face away? Would I also choose Barabbas? Or would I have the courage to look that man in the eye and recognize that he is there for me? Gibson doesn't answer these questions. He throws them into the air, like someone throwing a stone into a lake and watching the ripples expand. He doesn't want to impose a message. He wants to provoke an experience, and that's why the film doesn't age, because it's not bound by time. It's a mirror, and each generation that watches it sees something different, something that's not in the scenes, but in what they evoke within each person. Ultimately, this is the greatest power of true art, to awaken, to take the viewer out of their comfort zone, to make them feel, think, and question, and this is only possible when the artist is willing to dive deep, even if it means losing everything. Mel Gibson dived in, and emerged with a work that divided the world, but that, at the same time, united millions of people around a forgotten truth, that sacrifice, when driven by love, is the most revolutionary gesture there is. After the release of The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson could have taken the easy route. He could have capitalized on its success, released spin-offs, cozied up to religious leaders, or joined the awards circuit that had previously scorned him. But he did none of those things. He disappeared. He withdrew. And that post-impact silence was as eloquent as the film itself. Because he knew there was no point in trying to explain what he had done. Those who understood, understood. Those who didn't may never understand. And at that point, Gibson had already accepted the loneliness that accompanies those who dare to step out of line. While many accused him of making a pamphlet, too religious, or ultra-violent film, what few understood was that The Passion was not just an artistic project. It was a confession, a cry for help, an attempt at redemption. Gibson was battling his own inner demons, and he projected all of that onto a cinematic altar. The blood, the pain, the silence of Christ. All of this was also a mirror of his own anguish. It was him, saying, I too have fallen, I too need salvation. And this public exposure of the intimate is something extremely rare in modern cinema, because we live in a time where films are made to please, where every choice is tested in opinion groups, where every detail is calculated to maximize profit and minimize rejection. Gibson did the opposite. He chose to provoke. He chose to divide. He chose to touch on wounds that the world prefers to hide. And for that he was rejected, because the current world does not know how to deal with the raw truth. It bothers. It demands change, and change hurts. This is where the figure of Mel Gibson becomes symbolic. He embodies in his own flesh the archetype of the scapegoat. He burns himself on the altar of the industry to remind us that the system does not tolerate dissent. It does not tolerate faith. It does not tolerate surrender. And when someone dares to touch on these issues with depth and truth, the system reacts with fury. Not because it fears the artist himself, but because it fears what he awakens in people. And Gibson awakened something very dangerous: conscience, awareness that we are numb, that we have become accustomed to superficial cinema, where everything is a spectacle and nothing is true, that we have exchanged depth for empty entertainment. The Passion of the Christ was a slap in the face to this mentality, and not only because of the content, but because of the way it was made. With total independence, without big studios, with a team willing to sacrifice comfort for impact, a true act of artistic resistance. And as paradoxical as it may seem, it was precisely this independence that made it even more of a target for attacks. Because if the film had been made by a major studio, with filters and moderation, it might have been more acceptable. But the fact that a single man had paid for everything, betting his fortune, his reputation and his career, was disturbing. Because it showed that there is still room for courage, that it is still possible to make art with truth. And that is very dangerous for a system that profits from alienation. Over the years, the silence surrounding Gibson has grown thick. He has become the name that is not mentioned, the talent that is ignored. Even with new, masterfully directed films like Hacksaw Ridge, he has never been completely forgiven, because what he did was not just bold. It was unforgivable to a system that demands conformity. He confronted the establishment with the most powerful symbol in history, Christ. And he did it unapologetically. But it is precisely at this point that Gibson's figure rises beyond the cinema. He becomes a symbol, a reminder that all true transformation requires sacrifice, that there is a price to be paid for touching the sacred, and that often those who dare to do so end up being crucified, not with nails, but with mockery, cancellation, manipulation, and isolation. It is the same script that repeats itself throughout history. When someone talks too much or feels too much, they are seen as a threat. And yet he did not back down. He did not retract his statement. He did not change a single word of what he had done. And that, in itself, is an act of spiritual resistance, because we live in an age where everyone seems to be bending their opinions to the wind, where few remain standing when the tide turns. Gibson stood, bleeding, bruised, questioned, but standing, and that to many is a miracle in itself. Ultimately, this is perhaps the greatest contribution he left, a reminder that truth is expensive, but worth every penny. That profound beauty always disturbs. That authentic faith does not fit into slogans, and that, behind the cameras, there are still souls willing to suffer to convey what is eternal. If you've made it this far, it's because you've felt the weight and truth of this journey. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, and comment below with a word or phrase that resonated with you. It could be truth, sacrifice, or whatever touches your heart. It really helps.